I'm recording this because I'm not sure anyone will believe what I saw during the last 72 hours, and because every time I close my eyes, I keep hearing the same dull hum behind my ears, like a transformer warming up, waiting for the current to rise again. My name isn't important, and my editor will probably cut half of this if it ever reaches him. But I've worked as an investigative reporter for 12 years, and I've never encountered anything that felt this coordinated, this deliberate, or this aware of being watched. The assignment started as a routine follow-up for a regional piece about a rural broadcasting tower, officially decommissioned in 1999, but still drawing erratic power from a forgotten substation. Locals complained about flickering lights, strange radio interference, and a metallic echo near the old access road. The story felt dull at first, almost nostalgic. Another dying piece of infrastructure stubbornly clinging to life. I drove out expecting to find rusted steel and a cold transmitter without personality. Instead, from the moment I stepped out of the car, the place felt unbearably charged, like the air was saturated with a low-frequency vibration just beneath the normal soundscape, something that made my jaw feel heavy. The tower rose above the pines like a black tooth, darker than it should have been against the overcast sky. My equipment reacted before I did. My audio recorder flickered even when powered off, and my backup camera wouldn't calibrate exposure, shifting between underexposed and blown out without any clear cause. I'd seen electromagnetic interference before, but not at this distance and not so responsive to movement. The chain-link fence around the structure looked cut in several places, the metal curls clean despite years of disuse, as if someone had slipped in and out recently. Inside the perimeter, the soil was disturbed, not by animals, but by the unmistakable patterns of heavy boots pacing in straight, purposeful lines. Everything suggested activity, though the official records insisted the place hadn't been serviced in decades. I followed the trail to the base of the tower where a maintenance hatch sat slightly open. The angle wasn't natural. The hinge was bent outward, as if pressure had been applied from the inside. A warm draft blew from the gap. It carried no smell, no dust, nothing organic, just a faint electrical warmth, the kind that fills a server room. When I reached for the hatch, the static in the air intensified, crawling up my fingers like invisible needles. My recorder turned itself on in my pocket and captured a short burst of distortion, a rising tone cut abruptly by silence. I hesitated, and for a moment I thought I heard something deeper within the tower, not movement exactly, but a rhythmic pulsing, too slow to be machinery, too steady to be natural. I should have left then, but walking away would have meant admitting fear, and fear doesn't fit in a report. I documented the hinge, photographed the interior darkness, and pushed the hatch open. The metal groaned, not from rust, but from tension, as if it had been bracing itself. A narrow service tunnel descended at a sharp angle, illuminated by a single emergency strip light that should not have been functioning. It buzzed faintly, synchronized with the pulse I'd heard from outside. I climbed down 3 steps before the temperature shifted abruptly. The warmth vanished. The air became cold enough to crystallize breath, and the buzzing cut out completely, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt like pressure. I recorded everything, describing each sensation, each change, but listening back now, I noticed that some moments are blank, like the tape was edited during playback. At the end of the tunnel, I reached a small control room packed wall to wall with outdated equipment, all powered, all humming as if they'd never stopped operating. Panels flickered with red diagnostic codes I couldn't identify, and across the center console lay a set of handwritten log sheets, all dated within the last 4 weeks. None were signed. All referenced night transmissions and field responses detected along corridor vectors, terminology that doesn't appear in any telecommunications glossary I checked. I was preparing to photograph the logs when a sharp metallic click echoed through the chamber, like a relay being thrown. The lights dimmed, then stabilized, and the hum in the walls shifted to a deeper resonance. Something had recognized my presence. And then the radio set on the far desk crackled to life, tuning itself without input, aligning to a single frequency that emitted a low whispering static, shaping itself as if on the verge of forming words. I backed toward the exit, but the hatch above slammed shut with a hollow finality I didn't hear so much as feel. The radio hiss intensified. The whisper resolved into a pattern. And that was when I realized I wasn't alone in that room. I didn't see the figure at first. I only noticed a change in the air, a faint displacement behind me that made the loose papers on the console tremble. The radio continued its low whispering pattern, looping fragments of sound too even to be random, but too broken to be language. I forced myself to turn slowly, expecting to see a person who'd been living down there or a technician sent without documentation. But the corner was empty. What wasn't empty was the reflection on the glass of the diagnostic panel. A silhouette standing directly behind me, still and tall, impossibly tall for the confines of the room. When I spun around, the space was vacant again, yet the sense of proximity remained like breath on the back of my neck without warmth. I raised my recorder and spoke steadily, describing each detail so I wouldn't convince myself later that I'd imagined it. But the recorder responded with a stuttering glitch, its LED blinking erratically even though the battery was fresh. The hum in the console deepened, and the radio's whisper aligned into a slow modulation that felt intentional, almost conversational, as though it was adjusting itself to my presence. I stepped toward the hatch, testing it, but it held firm against my weight. The metal wasn't locked. It felt anchored by something on the other side. The pulse returned then, the same rhythm I'd heard outside the tower, except now it was closer, resonating through the walls and floor, as if the entire structure had a heartbeat. I scanned the control room again and noticed a second door I hadn't seen before, partially concealed behind a cabinet. It wasn't on any blueprint I studied. The frame was narrower than standard maintenance access, reinforced with brushed steel plates bearing no markings. The door stood slightly ajar, and behind it a faint bluish glow pulsed in sync with the tower's vibrations. I knew I shouldn't open it, but the hatch behind me remained unresponsive and the air felt as if it were subtly pushing me forward. When I touched the door's edge, the glow brightened, reacting like a sensor acknowledging contact. Inside was a vertical shaft that descended farther than the tower's documented foundation depth. Cable bundles lined the sides, all recent, untouched by rust or dust, descending into an artificial darkness that didn't behave like the absence of light, but like a texture swallowing illumination at the edges. The glow came from a faint panel several meters below, a circular ring emitting cool pulses. Before I could decide whether to climb down, the radio behind me cut out in a sharp burst, and a moment later a second speaker, hidden somewhere in the shaft, emitted the exact same burst with a slight delay, as though the tower were passing my presence deeper into itself. I whispered a note into the recorder, but the device responded with complete silence. Its microphone light extinguished though the power remained on. That was when I finally heard the first true sound from below. Not machinery, not interference, but something moving with a slow, deliberate scrape, as if dragging along the shaft wall. It paused whenever I moved, listening. When I held my breath, it continued, coming closer in uneven intervals. I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the shaft, but the glow began to dim, and with each pulse the cold in the room intensified. I felt the pressure return around my temples, a low internal buzzing like a distant alarm building toward a threshold. I retreated from the shaft and returned to the control consoles, searching for any manual override for the hatch. Most of the switches were labeled with cryptic abbreviations: C vector, R phase align, field coupling active. Only one stood out: primary relay enabled, glowing a steady orange. When I toggled it, the hum in the tower shifted into a higher register, and the bluish glow in the shaft vanished entirely. The movement below stopped, but only for a moment. Then something heavy struck the bottom of the shaft with a reverberation that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I didn't wait to see if it was climbing. I turned back to the hatch, pushed again, and this time it yielded slightly, as though whatever held it had weakened. I forced my shoulder against it until it swung open with a sharp metallic crack that echoed down the tunnel. I stumbled into the cold night air and slammed it shut behind me. The forest around the tower was silent in a way that didn't belong to nature. Even the wind seemed suspended. The tower's red beacon lights flickered once, then stabilized as if nothing had happened. When I checked my recorder, it displayed a full memory error despite being almost empty earlier. Only one file remained: a few seconds of audio containing a single pulse identical to the tower's internal rhythm. And beneath that pulse, barely audible, was a second sound: a slow inhale. I spent the next hour circling the tower's perimeter, trying to convince myself that the sound on the recording had been an artifact, a layered echo created by the machinery or my own footsteps. But the more I replayed it, the more certain I became that it had intention behind it. Something inside that shaft had been waiting, and if I hadn't toggled that relay, I'm not sure the hatch would have ever opened again. I decided to return to my car and leave the site entirely, but the forest felt different on the way back, almost rearranged. The path I'd taken earlier seemed longer, the trees leaning slightly toward the tower, as if pulled by a gradient I couldn't see. My headlights were off, but the world around me carried its own dim illumination. Not moonlight exactly, but a faint radiance that clung to the edges of objects like static. When I reached the clearing where I'd parked, the engine lights on my dashboard were already on even though I'd removed the keys. The battery hummed softly, matching the pulse from the recording. I checked the hood, half expecting to find the cables warm or vibrating, but the engine was cold to the touch. My phone had no signal. Even the compass app rotated slowly, unable to settle. I tried the ignition anyway. The car coughed once, then the headlights blinked on without turning the engine over. They pointed directly toward the access road, illuminating a figure standing at the tree line. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a ranger or a trespasser, but the outline was wrong. Too thin, too elongated, with its shoulders slightly sloped as though the bones beneath them were arranged differently. The moment the lights hit it, the figure retreated a half step, not walking but folding backward into the trees in a fluid motion that left no sound behind. I locked the doors out of instinct, even though the gesture felt childish against something like that. The pulsing in the cabin intensified, rattling the mirrors. I shut the headlights off and waited in the dark, watching the tree line for movement. Nothing emerged, but the forest didn't feel empty. Every second stretched, the silence thick and weighted with expectation. Eventually, I forced myself to start documenting again, whispering observations into the recorder, even though the microphone still refused to acknowledge input. My breath sounded too loud in the confined space. After several minutes, I gathered the courage to step out of the car and check the trunk for the backup power pack, thinking I might be able to jump the ignition manually. The air outside was sharp and metallic, almost synthetic, and the soil beneath my boots vibrated in faint ripples like the aftershock of distant machinery. As I reached the trunk, I noticed fresh impressions leading from the forest toward the tower. Long hollow prints, not boot tracks, spaced too unevenly to belong to any animal I recognized. They seemed to sink deeper near the hatch area, as if drawn there repeatedly. When I looked back at the tower, something was different. A new light pulsed from within the topmost section, faint but unmistakable. According to all records, that beacon had been disconnected from the grid years ago, yet now it glowed in slow rotations, scanning the treetops with a cold white arc instead of the usual aviation red. The beam passed over me once, and even at a distance, the air pressure around my chest tightened, like being momentarily caught in a vacuum. I crouched behind the car, waiting for the next rotation, but the light didn't pass again. It stayed fixed on a single point deep in the forest, illuminating a patch of darkness that refused to reflect the glow. I followed its aim and noticed the same figure I'd seen earlier, except now it stood perfectly still, facing the tower, as if listening. And then, with a slow tilt of the head, it turned toward me. The pulse in the ground synchronized instantly. The pressure behind my eyes spiked, making the world blur at the edges. I grabbed the power pack and retreated into the car, slamming the door and fumbling with the cables. The engine resisted twice, then roared to life in a burst of sound that felt violently out of place in the quiet. The figure didn't flinch. It simply remained at the edge of the clearing, watching, its silhouette distorted by the beam from the tower. I shifted into drive and accelerated down the road, gravel spraying behind me. The trees blurred in the headlights, bending inward unnaturally, the branches twisting as if reacting to the passing of the vehicle. Only once I was several kilometers away did the pulsing fade, replaced by normal night sounds, crickets, wind, distant water. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the tower's white beam was still visible above the treetops, and for a moment I could swear the forest beneath it moved like something breathing. When I finally reached the main road, my phone regained signal for a second, just long enough to display a single notification, an audio file titled "Reception Confirmed," time-stamped exactly when the hatch had closed behind me underground. I drove through the night without stopping, but distance didn't bring clarity, only a thinning of whatever presence had been gathering around me. By dawn, the world looked ordinary again, washed in the kind of muted gray that makes everything feel harmless. But the illusion broke the moment I checked the rearview mirror and saw the faintest distortion ripple across the glass, the same way heat bends air above asphalt. It vanished when I blinked, leaving me unsure whether it was real or a residual imprint from the tower's influence. I reached a small town before noon and parked behind an abandoned gas station to sort through my recordings. Every file except the last one had corrupted overnight. The remaining audio, the one titled "Reception Confirmed," played as a clean pulse at first, identical to the heartbeat-like rhythm in the tower. But after 16 seconds, the sound modulated into something that felt like speech without phonetics, a pattern mimicking cadence rather than language. It grew progressively more synchronized with my breathing until the recorder abruptly shut itself off. I tossed the device onto the passenger seat, but even then the rhythmic compulsion lingered inside my chest, as though my body carried a copy of that hidden frequency. I tried documenting the events on paper, but each time I wrote about the underground shaft or the figure in the trees, the words felt wrong, like describing a shadow without its source. I decided to send a preliminary report to my editor from the public library's Wi-Fi. As soon as I powered on the laptop, the cursor began flickering, jumping between lines before I even typed a word. The screen brightness dipped in and out with the same slow pulse I now recognized too well. I shut the lid and left immediately, knowing instinctively that the interference wasn't random. It was proximity. Something had followed me, not physically, but through the recordings, through whatever that tower transmitted for decades without oversight or acknowledgement. I checked into a cheap motel far from the main road, hoping isolation would break the signal, but at dusk the air inside the room shifted. The old wall-mounted television, powered on by itself, screen glowing gray with no input. The same frequency pattern echoed faintly through its speakers, muffled, as though trying to reconstruct a connection across static. I unplugged it, yet the glow persisted for several seconds after the cord dropped from the socket. I waited in silence until the hum faded, using the time to reflect on the logs I'd found underground. They mentioned field responses along corridor vectors, which I'd assumed referred to radio propagation paths. But after what I encountered, I began to suspect they meant something else. Movements or entities responding to transmitted stimuli. The tower hadn't been abandoned. It had been incubating something. The realization settled heavily as night deepened outside, pressing against the thin motel windows with a slow cyclic throb. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Measured, deliberate, too controlled to belong to any wandering guest. They stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, but instead a low vibration passed through the wood, resonating in my ribs. I checked the peephole. The corridor was empty, yet the floor beneath the doorframe trembled as though someone tall and weightless were standing there. I retreated to the far wall, whispering details into my phone's voice recorder. Halfway through describing the sensation, the phone screen glitched, lines tearing across it like an analog signal forcing its way through digital hardware. The device overheated instantly. I dropped it, and when it hit the carpet, it emitted the same single inhalation I'd heard on the original tower recording. That was the moment I understood the truth. The tower wasn't broadcasting. It had been receiving, waiting for a specific pattern, a specific presence, something capable of traveling through mediums, metal, circuitry, magnetic fields, even memory. And by entering the control room, by touching the relay, by listening too long, I had become part of the channel. At dawn, I packed my belongings and prepared to leave, but before stepping outside, I noticed a new file on the dead phone screen. No timestamp, no size, just the title, Second Contact. My reflection in the black glass wavered slightly, as if something behind me were leaning closer, studying the outline of my face. I didn't wait to see if it would resolve into a shape. I left the motel, left the town, left everything. I'm recording this final account from a borrowed tape deck miles away from anywhere familiar. I don't know how long I have before the signal finds me again, but I need this on record. Need someone to understand that what I encountered wasn't a malfunction or a haunting or the leftover tremors of dying technology. It was an intelligence distributed across infrastructure, using abandoned circuits as pathways, testing for resonance in whoever strayed close enough to hear it. If this tape is ever found and you notice a faint pulse in the silence between my words, do not follow it. Do not search the coordinates of the old tower. Do not attempt to finish its message, because it listens for acknowledgement. And once you acknowledge it, it answers,